Welcome to the Writer Reads Short Stories. This is Death Comes in Bone, Part 2. Please, Tan, your father wants you to ascend next year and I to stand beside you. This could be the last adventure we have together, and I want you to see it before I let the wizards and priests loose upon it. Is it that important? You should see it. Columns like those Mascalon found last year. If the discoveries are half so good, I want to be known as the one who discovered it. Tanag had understood. That Arrin wanted to share his discovery had been a sign of the strength of their friendship, he thought, for Arrin had grown up in the prince's shadow all his life. There were no guarantees the find wouldn't be assigned to him instead. Arrin had paused to blow a kiss to Maeta as they rode out. I shall marry her some day, he'd said. But what of your Lenara? Aren't you betrothed? I shall marry them both, Arrin had replied, laughing, and Tanag's spirits had lifted at the sight of his friend's joy, even though he'd been sure Arrin jested. Surely you'll have to choose eventually, Tanag had challenged, and Arrin had laughed and refused to reassure him until, discomfited, Tanag had asked him to describe what he'd found. Seeing the structure before him, Tanag couldn't help but notice how closely it matched Arrin's tale. Pushing memories of Arrin aside, Tanag stepped closer to the temple, noting how the beasts lifted their heads when his foot touched the bottom step leading to the entrance. He took another step, and the beasts returned to their feasting. How did they survive when there were no intruders to eat? Standing beneath the eaves, Tanag inspected the columns more closely. Inscribed upon them were the pictures and runes Arrin had described. The walls of the portico were painted with frescoes, oddly bright after such a long time buried. Tanag began to wonder if it had not always stood there, hidden from sight. Trailing a bony finger along the wall, he'd stepped beneath the portico and felt the magic reaching out to greet him. Strands of power that wound up from the tiled floor to touch his heart and blur his sense of purpose. Perhaps he should be grateful that Arrin had led him here, since a better suitor for Maeta there never was. Tanag stopped, took a step back, remembering Arrin's breath on his neck as his friend had driven the yellowthorn deep. I have plans for Maeta, his friend had whispered. She will feed my power. I'll kill you if you bring her harm, Tanag had tried to snarl, but all that came out of his mouth were soundless gasps and bubbles of blood as pain and poison flooded his system. I'll kill you if you hurt her. He had been gripping the sword hilt as he'd said it, trying to draw the blade, trying to defend himself from an enemy he hadn't known he had. With an effort, he pulled himself free of the memory, back to the reality of where he was. The frescoes and runes were exactly as Arrin had described them. Arrin had denied going any further than the portico, but he'd been insistent about the value of what lay behind its doors. Tanag took another step backward, reached the top of the stairs, and turned around. Arrin had also described the pedestals that stood either side of the stairs, 3 either side, 6 in all, atop of which stood statues of furred dragons or reptiloid cats. Arrin had always had a way with words. Tanag used to tease him about becoming a storymaster, but his friend had preferred to guard his back. Well, now Tanag knew why. He trotted down the stairs and the threads of magic fell away. The sound of his bare-boned feet on the rock disturbed him, and he moved over to where one of Divis's companions lay. In life, perhaps, their feet would not have matched, but without flesh, Tanag had no trouble pushing his foot inside the soft leather boot. He admired its workmanship as he pulled it on, and then realized a dilemma. While they fit his feet without any problem, the boot remained loose, unable to grip his shin bones as they would have gripped his calves. Tanag tried a few experimental steps, found the boots lodged around his feet, and stayed on, even though they flapped around his legs. With a shrug, he decided to give himself until he reached the yellowthorn at the cave entrance to work out if he was better off with them than without. At least he was able to move more quietly. A clinking shiver of sound caught his attention, and Tanag looked over at where one of the beasts was trying to reach the lungs and heart of another fallen intruder. The clinking came from a finely meshed chain shirt. It took Tanag some time to remove it, with the beast snarling and lashing its tail all the while, but not, apparently, willing to touch him. It subsided with reluctance when he dropped the corpse at its feet. "This is all I need," Tanag said, showing it the medallion and chain shirt, and trying not to hear how his voice came out as a sibilant whisper. If he'd had flesh, he'd have had goosebumps. As it was, the sound sent a shudder through his soul. Tanag pulled the chain shirt over his head and let it settle across his shoulders. Then he readjusted the medallion, sword, and belt so they sat over it. Now he was ready to face the world beyond. The sunlight was something he hadn't counted on. It wrenched a cry of pain from him and sent him stumbling back into the shadow of the cave entrance. Sunlight. Once he'd revelled in it, enjoyed its touch on his skin. Now the feel of it made him almost mad with pain, even diluted into dapples by the overhanging yellowthorn. How was he going to reach Arrin and the demoness by his side? Snorting disturbed his despair, an uneasy whicker of sound. A restless stamp of hoofs revealed the adventurers had not walked to the caverns. Tanag wondered who had sent them, and cursed himself for not thinking to ask before. After all, he and Arrin had not come here by chance. Arrin had claimed to have found it in his studies, but Tanag wasn't sure he believed him. Arrin had not much time for study once he discovered Lenara and the joys of her bed. His friend had dwelt on little else until finally Tanag had been forced to forbid him more than one mention of it a day, and a short one at that, and only when no women were present. In truth, he did not believe everything Arrin told him of those times. Now, though, it's true, he thought, and there are some things of which a gentleman should never speak. Arrin had mocked him for saying so, but then Arrin had been no gentleman. Tanag wept for Maeta and considered the horses. In the end, he spent the day contemplating the sunshine's forbidden beauty and waiting for nightfall. He wished he could sleep, but after however long he'd lain unknowing, the remnants of his body could not find oblivion in rest. "I can sleep when I'm dead," he whispered, ignoring the nervous wicker to his right, and hoping what he said was true. The horses were surprisingly easy to catch, and the magic held him together as he mounted. Tanag wondered why, when the animals were supposed to be sensitive to the evils of undead, they had even let him near, especially Divis's charger. "I've come to avenge my sister," Tanag told it, "and possibly your master as well." The big bay had lowered its head and whiffled uncertainly down where the chainmail covered his breastbone and ribs. It had paused and snuffled against his shin bones, then gently bunted him with its head. Intelligence shone in its bright dark eyes, making Tanag curious as to how much it could understand. In the end, he decided it did not matter. As long as the beast would carry him where he wanted, he did not really care. He waited, watching as the last vestige of light faded from the sky, observing the color leach from the surrounding countryside, and observing the resulting shades of gray turn to black. When the world refocused as clear as day, Tanag understood why undead were so hard to defeat at night. The darkness was no hindrance. He gathered the reins and guided the bay out of the yellowthorn thicket, letting the other horses follow as they would. Having released them, Tanag left them to find their own ways home. The way back to town was just as long as he remembered, but more overgrown and with fewer signs of cattle or travellers. Why would Arrin have let it get so wild? Tanag kicked the bay forward, trotting where he could, cantering when there was enough room, and walking when he had to. The moon was halfway to its zenith when he reached the outskirts. The streets were quiet, but there was no movement inside the first inn, and people dancing at the tavern he and Arrin used to visit in deep disguise. Back then, it would never have done for the townsfolk to see their prince too much at ease. Or so his father had said. His father. Tanag felt a frisson of pain and the first spark of rage. The bay shifted restlessly beneath him, and Tanag wondered how long it would be before undeath took him in full. Perhaps the evil did not come all at once, and he had to hurry if he was not to lose himself to rage. The tavern was his best chance of finding where Arrin was living now. Turning the horse down an alley beside his once favourite establishment, Tanag settled it beside a side door and waited. The first man to exit, answering nature's call, would be his target. This close to midnight, he did not have long to wait. The door opened, and a mop-haired merchant came out. He was older than Tanag remembered, and his paunch was definitely broader. But the prince remembered the merry mischief in the man's eyes, recalled the way he brushed his hair from his eyes when he was working a difficult bargain, and knew Harish would sell his mother if the profit was large enough. Harish, he mused. Well, I could have done worse. As the merchant registered the horse beside the door and turned, Tanag lunged, keeping his seat by sheer force of will as he grabbed Harish's shirt front. "Where can I find Arrin?" he rasped, the anger again bubbling to the surface and threatening to subsume him. His question was lost in Harish's exclamation of fright, so Tanag repeated it. "Who?" Harish whimpered through a chatter of teeth, a dark stain spreading from his crotch and down his leg as he looked into Tanag's eye sockets. His eyes grew wide and he opened his mouth again, although it took several attempts for him to ask it again. Whom did you seek?" No fool, and with a strong instinct for survival, Harish showed he understood the skeleton sought someone. His eyes bulged in a face drained of colour, and the scent of fresh urine filled the air. But his gaze flitted over Tanag's face, over Tanag's shoulders to the end of the alley as though looking for assistance. Tanag did not give him time to think of calling for help.